The night Renata Voss looked across her mother's dining table at me and said, "You will never be family, Isla, not to this family, not really." There were 7 people in that room. Daniel's parents sat at either end of the table. His aunt and uncle had driven 2 hours for Sunday dinner. His cousin Marcus was home from college for the weekend. Daniel sat right beside me, his shoulder an inch from mine. And not one of those 7 people said a single word back to her. Not one. I was 28 years old, wearing the blue dress Daniel told me was his favorite, holding a glass of Pinot Noir I had Googled specifically because I wanted to bring something that paired well with pot roast. That was the kind of effort I was putting in. I had just finished clearing the dinner plates because it felt like the right instinct when you're the new girlfriend and you want to show the family you're not above a little work. Renata waited until I sat back down. She looked at me the way someone looks at a word they already know how to spell and find tedious. She smiled. And then she said it. "You will never be family, Isla. Not to this family." Not really. I didn't cry. I didn't push back my chair. I didn't look at Daniel for rescue, though I felt him go completely still beside me the moment she finished the sentence. I looked at Renata for 3 measured seconds, wrapped my hand around my wine glass, and finished the rest of my Pinot in one quiet, deliberate sip. I didn't know then what I know now. That 4 years later, Renata Voss would be calling me every 6 hours with a voice that had lost every one of its edges, asking me to please, Isla, please, just sign the papers. That a $280,000 property deed with my name on it, my legal name, Isla Mercer-Voss, would sit in a probate lawyer's office like a loaded question she had never anticipated. That the woman who announced to a full dining room that I would never belong would discover, in the most specific and irreversible way possible, that she had been wrong since the first Sunday she met me. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I met Daniel Voss on a Tuesday in February, 4.5 years before any of this. I was a property manager at Caldwell & Pierce, a mid-size real estate firm downtown. He came in to handle the lease transfer on a commercial unit his company was subletting. He was organized, patient, asked exactly the right questions, and stayed 20 minutes past the scheduled appointment talking to me about whether the building's original hardwood floors could be restored. I told him it depended on the subfloor condition and the depth of the boards, but probably yes. He came back 3 days later with 2 coffees and the subfloor question fully answered. He had driven out to the building on his lunch break and measured the floor thickness himself with a tool he borrowed from a neighbor. He showed me the numbers on his phone. I told him they could definitely be restored. We had our first real date that Saturday. By March we were inseparable. By October I had met his parents. By the following January, I had met Renata. The first 10 months of loving Daniel felt like the version of a relationship you are too cautious to fully trust because you keep waiting for the part where the ground shifts. He was steady in a way I had not experienced before. He remembered the things I told him the way you remember directions to somewhere you genuinely want to go. He called when he said he would. He showed up when it mattered. He was not performing attentiveness, he was just attentive, the way some people simply are, as a baseline function of who they are rather than a strategy. I had loved people before who made me feel like I was always one wrong answer away from being reconsidered, and Daniel made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like I had arrived somewhere I was allowed to stay. Then I met his sister, and I understood that arriving somewhere and being welcome there are 2 entirely different things. Renata Voss was 32 that January, 3 years older than Daniel and 3 inches taller than me, with the particular confidence of a woman who built something from nothing and had never fully forgiven the world for requiring her to. She ran a small interior design firm she had started at 26 on credit and sheer force of will. I respected that immediately, the specific pride of someone who created a business with their own hands. She was genuinely smart. She was funny in short, precise bursts. And she had decided, before I walked through the door of her parents' house for that first Sunday dinner, that I was not what she had in mind for her brother. I know that now with certainty. I suspected it even then, watching her address every question and comment at the table to Daniel, to Ruth, to Howard, to Marcus, orbiting around me without ever landing on me, the way a conversation navigates a piece of furniture someone has placed awkwardly in the middle of the room. I told myself it was nerves, possibly hers, possibly mine. I told myself she just needed time. That is the thing nobody warns you about when you fall in love with someone from a close, complicated family. You spend the first year mistaking cruelty for caution. You mistake exclusion for shyness. You mistake a door that has been deliberately sealed for one that simply needs the right knock. I knocked for 4 years. Renata never answered. She called me Daniel's girlfriend at family events for the full 2 years we dated, even after we moved in together, even after Daniel told his parents in clear language that we were serious and he intended to stay that way. She introduced me to family friends with a half gesture and a trailing sentence, "This is," followed immediately by Daniel's name, as though my presence in the room was a footnote to his story rather than its own sentence. She once sat across from me at an entire Thanksgiving dinner and spoke to me only to ask me to pass the butter twice and the salt once. Not from hostility. Renata was too controlled for overt hostility. She did it from a kind of practiced indifference, the deliberate refusal to extend the small social courtesies that make a person feel they exist in a room. The kind of erasure that leaves no marks because it never makes contact in the first place. When Daniel proposed to me in November of our 3rd year together, a ring from an estate jewelry shop, a reservation at the Italian restaurant on Clifton where we had our first proper date, a question he asked before the appetizers arrived because he told me later he couldn't wait through a full meal with it sitting in his jacket pocket, I said yes before he finished asking. I cried in the restaurant bathroom afterward for 6 minutes, not from unhappiness, from a complicated relief I didn't quite have the words for yet. I was 30 years old, engaged to a man I loved genuinely and without reservation, and I was quietly terrified. Not of marrying Daniel. Of becoming, permanently and legally, adjacent to a woman who had already decided what I was worth and found it insufficient, and of watching that verdict calcify over decades of family dinners and holidays and milestone events that I would attend and be tolerated through but never truly welcomed into. The engagement changed nothing with Renata and changed everything about the stakes of nothing. Ruth and Howard were warm in the specific, unperformed way of parents watching their son be happy for 3 years and trusting the source of it. Ruth cried when Daniel showed her the ring. Howard hugged me so hard my feet left the floor briefly. But Renata looked at the ring the way you look at a piece of furniture someone has placed in the wrong room, not with contempt, exactly, but with the flat certainty that it would eventually need to be moved. She waited 3 weeks to contact me after the engagement. When she called, it was not to offer congratulations. It was to discuss the wedding. Specifically, she called to explain that the Voss family had certain traditions she wanted to make sure were honored, and she proceeded to describe a venue, a color palette, a guest list approach, and a floral direction, all of which she presented as the natural framework within which Daniel and I would be planning our wedding. She said our wedding 4 times in 20 minutes. Each time, it sounded like she meant hers. I wrote notes on a legal pad. I said at the appropriate intervals. I thanked her for calling. I told Daniel that night, with the legal pad open between us on the kitchen counter. He rubbed the back of his neck in the way he does when something is true and he is finding it inconvenient to hold. He said she meant well. I said I knew she meant well. I said I just needed her to mean well in a way that didn't involve rearranging my wedding around her vision of what a Voss wedding should look like. He talked to her that week. It helped the way a bandage helps a fracture, the surface looked tended to and the problem continued underneath. She fell quiet on the venue question for 11 days and then emailed me a link to the same lake house event space she had described on the phone, noting that it had one Saturday available in October and she wanted us to have the option before it was gone. The dinner where she said it happened in March, 2 months into our engagement. I have described the room already, the 7 people, the Pinot I brought, the plates I cleared. What I have not described is how the sentence landed. Not like a blow. More like a door closing. The precise, airless click of something being sealed. You will never be family, Isla. Not to this family. Not really. 7 people. 4 seconds of silence. Then the conversation resumed around me like water closing over a stone. Daniel's uncle asked Howard about a contractor he'd been using. Marcus talked about a midterm. Ruth got up to bring out the dessert. And I sat at the table and understood something I had been circling for over a year without finding the exact shape of it, that the Voss family's silence in that moment was not shock. It was familiarity. Renata had said the quiet part out loud this time, but the quiet part had always been there. I was not being told something new. I was simply being told it directly, finally, so there would be no confusion about where I stood. Daniel apologized that night. Twice. He said it wouldn't happen again. He said he would handle it. He said the right things in the right order, and I believed him and also understood that handling Renata was not a project with a completion date. It was a permanent condition of loving his family. The year between the engagement and the wedding was the year I learned the load-bearing architecture of a family that had never needed to make structural room for someone new. Ruth, who was genuinely kind to me in individual quiet moments, disappeared into a kind of collective passivity the moment Renata was in the room. When Renata changed the flower order 3 weeks before the wedding, overriding the arrangement Daniel and I had confirmed with the florist and substituting her own preferred palette, ivory and dusty rose in place of the terracotta and white we had chosen, and had it billed to the wedding account, Ruth said, "She has such a good eye for these things, you'll love it once you see it." I did not love it once I saw it. I loved the terracotta and white that I had spent 4 weekends choosing with my best friend Priya. But by then the deposit had been reallocated and the florist had already ordered the ivory roses, and I was 8 days from my wedding, and the calculation I made was the same one I had been making for 3 years. Is this worth the cost of the fight, or is this something I fold up and put away? I folded it up. I put it away. I walked down the aisle in a room full of ivory roses I had not chosen, and I married Daniel Voss in front of everyone who mattered, and I was, despite everything, genuinely happy. I just kept a running tally. Not out of bitterness. Out of professionalism. 6 years in property management teaches you to document everything, because the details you don't record are always the ones that matter later. Daniel's grandmother, Evelyn Voss, died 6 months before our wedding. She was 81, sharp and precise to the end, the kind of woman who sent handwritten thank you notes on monogrammed stationery and could recall the name of someone she had met once at a party in 1994. She had a lake cottage in Millhaven, 2 hours north, a white clapboard house on 2 acres with a dock that needed new planking, a kitchen window that faced east, and walls that smelled like pine and years of good summers. She had owned it outright since 1987. By the time she died, it was assessed at $280,000. I knew the assessment because Evelyn had asked me to walk through the property with her 18 months before she passed, on a Thursday afternoon when Daniel was stuck at work, and she had called me directly to ask if I was free. She wanted a professional opinion on deferred maintenance, the condition of the roof, the state of the dock, and what the property might realistically sell for if she ever decided to. She clarified that she was not planning to sell. She just wanted to know. I told her the truth, with numbers and specifics, the way I would with any client. She made tea. We sat on the dock for 2 hours in the late afternoon, and she told me about buying the property with her husband in their early 40s, about raising her children there every summer, about the quality of the light on the water at 4 in the afternoon, and why it was the thing she would miss most if she ever had to leave. She told me she was glad Daniel had found someone practical. She said the word practical the way some people say brilliant, like it was a quality she had been waiting a long time to encounter. Evelyn left the cottage to Daniel Voss and his lawfully wedded wife, jointly and an equal share in a will drafted 2 years before her death and updated 8 months before she passed. Her lawyer read that language at the estate meeting held 9 months after our wedding. The room went very quiet when he reached that clause. Daniel squeezed my hand under the conference table. Across from us, Renata's expression shifted by a precise and careful degree, the degree that corresponds to understanding that something you assumed was moving toward you has been redirected somewhere else, permanently and by design. She did not contest the will. There was no legal ground on which to do so. The language was unambiguous, the testator had been of sound mind, and Evelyn had apparently had a second conversation with her lawyer 6 months before she died to confirm the wording was exactly as she intended. Renata asked the lawyer one clarifying question, in a voice from which she had removed all inflection, and if either party were to predecease the other, does the surviving spouse inherit the whole? The lawyer confirmed yes. Renata nodded, smoothed her skirt, and said she had no further questions. 2 weeks later, she called me. Warm in a way she had never been warm before, not the warmth of someone who has decided to change, but the warmth of someone who needs something and has not yet worked out how to ask for it. I wrote down the date in my planner. I circled it in red. Because in 6 years of property management, I have learned one thing above all others: when someone who has been cold to you for 4 years suddenly runs warm, there is always a document underneath it. There is always something they need you to sign. The months after the estate meeting had a texture I had not encountered before with Renata. She invited Daniel and me to dinner twice, which was unprecedented in 4 years of knowing her. She asked about my work for the first time, genuinely asked, follow-up questions and everything. She sent me an article about historic property restoration with a note that said "thought of you." 3 exclamation points, from a woman who had previously communicated in monosyllables or silence. Daniel noticed. He said carefully, almost hopefully, "She seems like she's making an effort." I said yes. I was not being cynical. People do change, sometimes, for real reasons that have nothing to do with what they need from you. But I had also spent 4 years watching Renata operate, and I knew the difference between effort and approach. She was moving toward me because the property in Millhaven had 2 names on the deed and one of them was mine, and she had a second location on her design firm that was bleeding money at $6,400 a month, and the fastest capital available to her was a lake cottage she could not sell without my signature. She was being warm because she needed something from me. And for the first time in 4 years, the power in the room between us had shifted entirely, without a word, without a confrontation, without a single dramatic moment. Just a clause in an old woman's will, written by a woman who said practical like it was the highest compliment she knew, and a deed that had been sitting quietly in a lawyer's office, waiting for the right moment to matter. I wasn't angry yet. I was patient. I had been patient for 4 years already. I could be patient a little longer. But I was finished pretending I didn't know what was coming. And I was finished pretending that what the previous 4 years had cost me was nothing. Because it wasn't nothing. It was 4 years of cleared plates and swallowed sentences and ivory roses I did not choose and a dining room full of silence where one voice should have spoken up and didn't. 4 years of being told, in every language except words, that I did not fully count. The deed said otherwise. Evelyn had seen to that. And Renata, who had told 7 witnesses including her own brother that I would never be family, was about to find out exactly what family meant when it was written into a legal document and had to be honored whether she wanted to or not. Renata made her ask on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the estate meeting, over dinner at a restaurant she had chosen and reserved and described to me as just the 2 of us catching up. I knew before I sat down what the conversation would be about. I had known since the day her name appeared on my phone 3 times in 1 week with a warmth I did not recognize from 4 years of knowing her. I ordered the sea base. I listened to her talk for 17 minutes about her second location, the showroom on the north side of the city that she had opened 14 months earlier with genuine ambition and what turned out to be insufficient capital. The rent was $6,400 a month. The fit-out had run $47,000 over budget. She had 17 active clients at the main location and 4 at the second, which meant the second location was generating $8,200 a month against costs that exceeded it by nearly half. She told me all of this without framing it as a crisis, the way people describe a structural problem as an inconvenience when they need something from you and they don't want the weight of the real numbers to make you feel pressured. I noted the real numbers anyway, the way I always do, in the place where I store information that might matter later. Then she told me about the buyer. He was an architect from the city, mid-40s, looking for a lake property to renovate as a primary weekend residence. He had seen Evelyn's cottage through a connection in Renata's professional network, which meant she had been showing the property before she had asked me about selling it, before she had asked Daniel, before she had asked anyone except presumably herself. His offer was $278,000. She presented it across the table with the practiced ease of someone who has been rehearsing the presentation in the bathroom mirror, and she said it was a strong number for the current market and a clean close with no contingencies. She said the split would be straightforward, half to Daniel and me, half to her, according to the deed, which would give Daniel and me $139,000 and give her the capital she needed to stabilize the second location and fund the expansion she had apparently already committed to in conversations with a contractor whose deposit she had already paid. She said the word straightforward 3 times in 6 minutes. In my professional experience, the word straightforward is most frequently used by people who are hoping you won't read the fine print. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. I told Renata I needed time to review the offer and speak with a property lawyer before signing anything. The warmth in her expression did not disappear. It shifted, the way a light source shifts when you move the lamp, the room still technically lit, but the angle changed and certain things now cast longer shadows. She said of course, take all the time you need, and she paid the dinner bill with a smile that was doing significant structural work to hold itself in place. I drove home and called a lawyer I had worked with professionally for 2 years, a woman named Claire Haddon who specialized in estate and property law and charged $190 an hour and gave you the full picture without softening it for your comfort. I described the deed, the offer, Evelyn's will language, and the situation as I understood it. Claire said she would review everything and get back to me in 3 business days. She called back in 2. The offer at $278,000 was fair but not strong. A comparable property 2 miles from the cottage had sold for $294,000 3 months prior. The buyer Renata had found had made a low-end offer and described it as strong, which was technically true the way it is technically true to describe a 65 on an exam as a passing grade. Claire also confirmed what I already understood, both co-owners needed to agree to sell and both needed to sign. Neither party could compel the other. The deed was equal. The power was equal. And it had been equal since the morning Daniel and I stood in that lawyer's office 9 months into our marriage and heard Evelyn's clause read aloud. Renata called me 4 times in the 2 weeks I was reviewing the offer. The calls were warm and then patient and then warm again with a tightness underneath the warmth that was new, the specific tightness of someone who has commitments downstream of a decision they assumed someone else would make for them. She said things like I just need you to trust me on the pricing and I've been doing this for years, I know this market. She said what mattered most was keeping it in the family, by which she meant completing the sale she had already architected, using money that was half mine, to rescue a business situation she had created. And then, on a Wednesday evening, she said the thing that closed a door in me that I had been keeping carefully propped open in good faith. She said it quietly, almost gently, the way you say something you know is manipulative but are hoping will land as wisdom. She said, it's what Evelyn would have wanted, Isla. She loved this family. She wouldn't want a property dispute to divide us. I held the phone and did not speak for 3 full seconds. I thought about a dock in late afternoon light. I thought about tea in old mugs and a woman with precise handwriting who said practical the way other people say exceptional. Evelyn had updated her will 6 months before she died to confirm the language was exactly as she intended. Evelyn had known what she wanted. She had wanted me on that deed. Telling me what Evelyn would have wanted was the wrong sentence to say to the one person in the family who had actually sat with Evelyn and listened. That weekend, I drove to Millhaven alone. Daniel was working, and I didn't tell him where I was going, not because I was hiding anything, but because I needed to see it without the weight of anyone else's feeling about it. The cottage sat at the end of a gravel lane just off the lake road, white clapboard with green shutters, a porch that ran the full width of the front, and 2 enormous oak trees in the yard that had clearly been there far longer than the house. I had a key on my keychain. Evelyn had given it to me after our afternoon on the dock, pressing it into my palm with both hands and saying it was a spare and someone responsible should have it. I let myself in. The kitchen smelled like pine and old coffee, exactly as I remembered. The afternoon light came through the east window at an angle that turned the floor the color of warm honey. I walked through every room. I sat on the dock. I looked at the water for a long time. Then I called Claire Haddon and told her I was not ready to sign anything and asked her what my options were. She told me clearly, without editorializing. I thanked her. I drove home. I made dinner. I told Daniel that evening that I had been to the cottage and that I needed more time before deciding anything about the sale. He looked at me carefully, the way he looks when he is trying to understand something before he responds to it, which is one of the things I have always loved most about him. He said okay. He said we would figure it out together. He did not call Renata. He did not try to speed me along. He said okay, and I believed him. The Sunday dinner where everything came apart was the third week of October, a cool sharp afternoon with the smell of wood smoke coming through the Voss family's kitchen window when I walked in. Ruth had made pot roast, which meant it was the same meal as the night Renata said what she said 4 years ago, a coincidence I registered and set aside. Howard poured wine at the kitchen island while people settled at the table. Marcus was back from his graduate program for the weekend. Ruth's sister Carol was there with her husband Len. A full table. Renata arrived 12 minutes after everyone else, which was her habit, arriving after the room was assembled so that her entrance landed on an audience rather than a room still filling. She was wearing a cream blazer and the specific expression of someone who has been managing a problem for weeks and believes tonight is when it resolves. She hugged Ruth, kissed Howard on the cheek, squeezed Marcus on the shoulder, and sat down across from Daniel and me with the settled confidence of someone who has already run the ending of this dinner in her head and approved of how it goes. Howard passed the bread and said, almost conversationally, raising his glass in a small gesture toward Renata and then toward me, "Good news about the cottage. Renata mentioned you two are moving forward, getting things wrapped up. Glad it's staying smooth." The table nodded in the general direction of glad it's staying smooth. Ruth smiled in relief. Carol said something about families handling things together being such a gift. Renata's eyes came to mine across the table with the contained satisfaction of someone who has already planted the flag and is waiting for the ceremony. I set my bread plate down. I looked at Howard. I said, very evenly, actually, I haven't made any decision yet. I'm still reviewing the offer with my lawyer. The table did not go theatrically silent the way rooms do in films. It went quiet in the specific, actual way rooms go quiet when something has been said that lands differently than the people in it expected. Howard's glass lowered by an inch. Ruth's attention moved from the pot roast to my face. Marcus looked up from his phone. Renata's expression held for a beat, 2, 3, then something adjusted behind her eyes, a small recalibration, the kind you make when a plan you were confident in encounters an obstacle you didn't account for. She said, pleasantly, to the table rather than to me, Isla just needs a little more time to get comfortable with the details. It's fine. We're almost there. And I understood in that moment, clearly and without anger, that Renata had told this table a version of events in which my agreement was already secured, in which I was a formality rather than a party with equal legal standing, in which the decision had been made by the family and I was simply the last step in a process that everyone else had already completed. She had told Howard and Ruth and Carol and Len that the sale was moving forward because she needed it to be true badly enough that she had started treating it as true before it was. And the table had believed her because the table always believed her. Howard asked me, directly and with genuine concern in his voice, "Is there a problem with the offer, Isla?" I said yes. I said the offer was $16,000 below a comparable sale in the same area from 3 months prior. I said I had retained a property lawyer to advise me and I was not in a position to sign anything I had not independently assessed. I said it calmly and specifically, the way I say things at work when a number does not reconcile and I need to explain why before anyone moves forward. Renata put her fork down. It made a small precise sound against the plate. When she spoke, the warmth was gone entirely, and what replaced it was not cruelty exactly but something older and more familiar, the specific tone she had used with me for 4 years before she needed anything from me, the tone that did not quite acknowledge I was worth full attention. Isla. She said my name the way you say the name of a child who is making a situation complicated. This property has been in our family for 40 years. My grandmother built something on that land. I understand you want to be careful, but this is a family matter and we are asking you, as a family, to let us handle it. The table was very still. I looked at Renata. I thought about the word family. I thought about the way she had used it 4 years ago as a door she was closing, and the way she was using it now as a door she needed me to open. I thought about 7 people who said nothing on a night when one sentence should have been enough to stop everything. I said, the deed says it's also my matter. She exhaled through her nose. The kind of exhale that is controlled breathing masquerading as patience. You've been part of this family for 5 years. This property was in our family for 4 decades before you arrived. You don't get to just hold this hostage. Ruth said her name, quietly, just the one word, the way you say someone's name when you need them to stop but don't have the courage to say stop. Renata didn't stop. I'm trying to save my business. I have 11 employees. I have a contractor waiting. I have a buyer ready to close. And you are sitting here telling me your lawyer thinks the price should be $16,000 higher? This is not about the money, Isla. This is about you punishing me. The room went completely quiet. Not the earlier quiet of surprise. The deeper quiet of people who have just heard something said out loud that they had been privately aware of for a long time and were hoping would stay unspoken. I let the quiet hold for a moment. Then I said, I'm not punishing you, Renata. I'm reading the document. That's all I'm doing. I paused. You told me 4 years ago, at this table, with everyone who is currently in this room either present or represented, that I would never be family. I didn't argue with you. I didn't make a scene. I finished my wine and I passed the dessert and I drove home and I kept showing up for 4 more years, because Daniel is my husband and this is his family and I was willing to earn my place in it even after you told me I never would. Howard was looking at his plate. Ruth's hand was flat on the table beside her glass. Marcus was not looking at his phone. Carol and Len were very still. Evelyn did not agree with you. She sat with me for 2 hours on the dock of that cottage and she told me what it meant to her. She updated her will. She wrote the language herself. She put my name on the deed because she decided, on her own, that I belonged there. And I am going to honor what Evelyn decided, by taking it as seriously as she intended me to. I looked at Renata and I said the last part quietly, the way you say something that doesn't need volume to carry weight. She thought I was family. The silence after that sentence was complete. Renata opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer ticked. Howard's hand moved to the table beside Ruth's. Not a gesture, just a placement, the way a person steadies themselves when the ground has shifted and they are deciding whether to acknowledge it. Renata left 30 minutes after dinner. She did not stay for the apple tart Ruth had made or the coffee Howard put on. She said she had an early morning and she hugged her parents and she walked out the front door with her coat held in one arm rather than worn, which is what people do when they are leaving somewhere they wanted to leave 15 minutes ago but were managing their exit for appearances. The door closed. Howard and Ruth sat at the table with Daniel and me and Marcus and Carol and Len, and nobody said anything for a stretch of time that was long enough to be honest. Then Howard put his hands flat on the table and said, looking at neither Daniel nor me specifically but at the middle space between us, Renata shouldn't have said that. 4 years ago or tonight. Ruth's eyes went to me. They were red at the edges, not with tears exactly, with the particular color that comes from holding something back for long enough that it starts to show through the skin. She said, I'm sorry, Isla. I should have said something. I've been sorry about that for 4 years. I looked at her. I didn't rush to say it was all right, because it wasn't entirely all right and Ruth was not asking me to pretend that it was. She was just saying it out loud, finally, in the kitchen where she had served me pot roast for 5 years while her older daughter talked around me. I said, "Thank you for saying that." It was not forgiveness. It was the beginning of a space where forgiveness could eventually exist. That was enough for one night. Daniel held my hand in the car on the way home. He didn't fill the silence with words, which is one of the things I love most about him. He knows that some silences are doing necessary work and interrupting them is the wrong instinct. About halfway home, he said, "She should have said something that night." I should have said something that night. I said I know. He said he was sorry it had taken this long to hear it out loud in that room. I said I know that too. The car was quiet for the rest of the drive. Not a heavy quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something has been put down that you have been carrying for a long time. The physical sensation of a weight that is no longer on your shoulders but is still present enough that you can feel where it was. Renata called me at 9 the next morning. Her voice was different from anything I had heard from her before, not the practiced warmth of the past 6 weeks, not the cold indifference of the 4 years before that, not the controlled anger of the dinner. Just flat. Stripped down. She said, "I need the sale to happen, Isla. I have payroll in 3 weeks and I don't have the capital to cover it without the cottage." I said I understood. She said, "So you'll sign?" I said, "I'll sign when I have an offer that reflects the property's actual value, a clean agreement reviewed by my lawyer, and a timeline I have agreed to, not one that was set before anyone asked me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does that mean in practical terms?" I told her exactly what it meant. I had asked Claire Haddon to prepare a counteroffer at $294,000, matching the comparable sale, with a 60-day close. I would split the proceeds evenly with Daniel, as the deed specified. If the buyer would not meet the price, we would list it properly and find a buyer who would. I was not blocking the sale. I was conducting it correctly. I was treating a $280,000 asset like a $280,000 asset rather than a problem to be disposed of quickly because someone had not run their business carefully enough and was now in a bind. The buyer accepted $291,000 after 3 days of negotiation. Claire handled the counteroffer. I initialed every page and signed where my name was printed. The close happened 54 days later on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's conference room with good coffee and winter light coming through tall windows. Daniel and I walked out with $145,500. Renata walked out with the same. She paid her contractor. She met her payroll. She kept her 11 employees and her second location and the business she had worked for 6 years to build. None of that was something I wanted to take from her. I had never wanted to take anything from her. I had only wanted what Evelyn had decided I deserved, a seat at the table, my name on the document, my voice in the room when the room was deciding something that belonged to me. The extra $13,000 above her original offer paid for new planking on the dock of a cottage that was no longer ours, which is the kind of detail that satisfies something in me professionally. The right number is the right number. The paperwork should always say what is actually true. The weeks after that Sunday dinner moved differently than I expected. I had braced myself for turbulence, for Renata to recruit, for Ruth to mediate, for the family to fracture along the lines that cruelty under pressure tends to open up. Instead, what followed was quieter and, in some ways, harder to process than open conflict would have been. Families don't transform in the wake of a confrontation the way they do in stories. What actually happens is smaller and slower and more ambiguous than that. What actually happens is a Sunday call from Ruth that lasts 22 minutes instead of the usual 8, and she asks 3 questions about your week that are genuinely about your week and go nowhere else. What happens is Howard mentioning at Christmas that he and Ruth are thinking about downsizing in the next few years and asking if you might help them think through the numbers, as a professional, whenever they're ready. It is a small thing. It is not a small thing. It is the first time in 5 years someone in that family asked me to use the skill I actually have rather than perform the contentment they needed me to perform. I told Howard yes. I told him to call me whenever they were ready. I meant it without reservation. Marcus sent me a message 2 days after the dinner. It was direct in the way of someone young enough to say true things without the social cushioning that comes with accumulated caution. He wrote, "For what it's worth, I was there 4 years ago when she said that. I should have said something. I'm sorry I didn't." I read it twice. I wrote back, "Thank you. That matters more than you know." We exchanged nothing else about it. It was enough. It was more than enough. Sometimes the witness who finally speaks is worth more than the apology from the person who caused the wound, because the witness chose to look when they didn't have to, and chose to speak when they could have stayed comfortable and silent. Marcus was 20 years old when he sat at that table 4 years ago and said nothing. He was 24 now and said something. People can grow. I choose to believe that, because I have seen it happen in real time in that family, and that is more evidence than most people get. Renata's second location stabilized by January. She had the capital from the cottage sale, correctly negotiated, and she used it well, paid the contractor, cleared the outstanding vendor invoices, and brought on one additional designer for the north side showroom. By February the location was breaking even. By April it was modestly profitable. I know this not because Renata told me but because her business has a public profile and I have professional habits that include monitoring commercial activity in my sector. She is genuinely good at what she does. She was always good at it. The near collapse of her business was not inevitable, it was the predictable result of overextension without adequate capital reserves, a problem that $291,000 resolved more completely than $278,000 would have. The additional $13,000 that correct negotiation produced was not a moral victory. It was the difference between a business that fully stabilized and one that would have remained stretched and fragile going forward. I did not say that to her. The numbers said it themselves, and Renata is smart enough to read numbers. She called me in March. Not to discuss the family, not to apologize, not to perform warmth. She called because she had a commercial client purchasing a unit on Delmore Street and wanted an independent property assessment before closing. She said my name had come up professionally, one of her design clients had worked with Caldwell and Pierce and mentioned me by name. She asked if I had availability. Her voice was professional, precise, neither warm nor cold, the specific register of someone conducting legitimate business with someone they have decided to respect in a defined and bounded context. I said yes. I completed the assessment. I invoiced her at my standard commercial rate. She paid in 14 days, which is faster than most clients pay and almost certainly deliberate. We exchanged 5 emails across the engagement, all of them professional, all of them exact, none of them anything other than what they were. It was not friendship. It was not reconciliation. It was something I have come to think is more durable than either, it was acknowledgement. By making that call, Renata acknowledged that I was capable, that I was worth paying for, that my professional opinion had value she was willing to seek out and compensate correctly. It was the first time in 5 years that Renata Voss communicated to me that I was worth something. She communicated it in a property assessment invoice, which is, genuinely, the most Renata way that message could ever have arrived. And perhaps the most Isla way I could ever have received it. I want to be honest with you about what the whole experience cost. Because there is a version of this story that ends cleanly with the deed and the confrontation and the family finally saying the right things at the right table, and it feels resolved, like a room after you have opened all the windows. But the actual experience of it is not like opening windows. It is more like discovering that the thing you spent years trying to repair was never fully intact to begin with, and that the repair itself changes the shape of what you are left with. I grieve sometimes, quietly, for the sister-in-law I did not get to have. Renata is intelligent and capable and genuinely funny in short precise bursts, and she built a business from nothing at 26 on credit and conviction, and she is loved deeply by the person I love most in the world. There was a version of the years I spent in her orbit where we could have been close. Where she could have been the person I called when something went wrong at work, or when I needed a second perspective on a difficult decision, or simply when I needed someone in Daniel's family to see me and say so. That version was closed before I arrived. It was closed by a decision she made before she knew me, that I was not what she wanted for her brother and therefore not worth knowing at all. I do not hate her for that. I understand it the way you understand a structural flaw in a building. It does not make the building less real. It just explains why certain rooms always ran cold. You stop pretending the flaw is not there. You adjust what you expect from the structure. You build a clear and honest picture of what it actually is. Daniel and I went back to the cottage once before the close. I asked Claire Haddon to arrange a final walkthrough for us on a Saturday morning before the buyer's inspection, and we drove up in November with coffee from the gas station on Route 9 and no agenda. We walked through every room slowly. He showed me the window in the upstairs bedroom where he used to watch thunderstorms coming across the lake as a child, counting the seconds between the lightning and the sound. I showed him the east kitchen window and told him what the light did in the afternoon. We sat on the dock for an hour with the water flat and gray and cold around us. The planking needed replacing. I knew the condition of every timber on that dock from the afternoon I had walked it with Evelyn, and I knew the cost of fixing it and the cost of leaving it. He held my hand without filling the quiet with anything. I thought about a key pressed into my palm with both hands. I thought about the word practical used like a credential by someone who understood precisely what it meant. I thought about a woman who had updated her will 6 months before she died to confirm the language was exactly as she intended, and I understood, sitting on that dock in November with the water going silver in the flat light, that Evelyn had known what she was doing from the very first afternoon she invited me out there alone. She had made tea and listened to the way I talked about her property, with care, with specifics, with the exact quality of attention that understands what something is actually worth, and she had decided, this is the one I trust with half of what I built. Not because I was a Voss by marriage or name or any category Renata had been using as a measuring instrument for years. Because I was Isla. That was the whole point. That was the thing she wanted written into a legal document so it could not be argued away at a family dinner or quietly rerouted by people who had decided long before reading the clause that I did not count. Here is where I am now. I am 32 years old. I am a senior associate at Caldwell and Pierce following a January promotion that came with a new business development role and a salary I negotiated myself, clause by clause, the way I now negotiate everything. Daniel and I are under contract on a house, our own, both our names on every document from the first page, reviewed by a lawyer we hired together, with numbers that are honest from the first column to the last. I read every clause. I know what I am signing. I do not leave blank lines for the paperwork to catch up later. Ruth calls on Sundays sometimes, not every Sunday but some, and the calls are real in the way conversations are real when the person on the other end is talking to you rather than around you. Howard asked my professional opinion on a kitchen renovation last month and took 3 of my 4 recommendations, which is a better ratio than most of my paying clients achieve. Renata and I are not close. We are professional and honest about what we are, 2 people connected by a man they both love, doing the quiet necessary work of sharing a family without pretending the history between them is anything other than what it actually is. I do not think it will ever be more than that. I have made a full peace with what it is, because what it is now is something I chose, on terms I set, in a room where my voice carried the same weight as anyone else's at the table. The thing I keep returning to, the thing I want to leave with you, is not the deed or the confrontation or the $13,000 of correct negotiation. It is the key. The spare key Evelyn Voss pressed into my palm on a Thursday afternoon on a dock in late summer light because she had spent 2 hours with me and decided I was someone she trusted. She made that decision before she updated her will. She made it before any of the rest of this happened, quietly, on a dock, over tea, the way the most important decisions tend to be made, not in boardrooms or at dining room tables but in the small moments when one person looks at another and simply sees them clearly. I keep the key on my keychain now, between the office fob and the car key. The cottage belongs to someone else. The key opens nothing I currently own. But I keep it because it was the first time someone in Daniel's family held something out to me with both hands and said, "You are the one I trust with this." It was the first time someone in that family saw me for exactly what I was, not Daniel's wife, not an addition to the guest list, not a placeholder in the family photo, and decided that what they saw was precisely enough. Belonging to a family is not a title that gets handed down. It is a decision made by the people paying close enough attention to recognize what is actually in front of them. Renata never paid that attention. Evelyn always had. And the document she left behind said so in language her lawyer confirmed was exactly as intended, down to the last word, down to the last clause, down to the name on the deed that no one at that Sunday table had ever thought to question until they needed it to say something other than what it said. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.